Hi all, I hope you're well and being all right. My name is Victor Counter, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about my work on hope. So recently I had a paper published in the Journal of Happiness Studies, and I've been making it a habit to try to talk about my papers or my research as they come out, instead of them just, being in the journal, which I think is great. But just to be strategic in terms of how I communicate about my work beyond just academic audience or people that might be interested in reading the paper just because it's also related to their work or their research. And so today I want to talk about if you will, the geography of hope. I think it's what the paper is about. The paper kind of looks at hope in 22 countries. And I think, oftentimes we think that money and safety create hope, but actually the data from our research, from our work kind of proves that they really don't, that what really creates hope is people's sense of connection. And I talk about this in my theory, relational theory of hope, and the idea there is that hope is something that is sustained based on the stable connections that people have, whether it's to the sacred, whether it's to place, whether it's to their significant others. And in the paper also, I also introduced the idea of spatial hope, and that is really the idea that our zip code or our culture, for example, ultimately shapes or even the places that we find ourselves in the world, that it shapes our ability to believe in the. And so I want to kind of run through the key ideas in this paper and some of the key findings, and how we found the contrast between let's say Indonesia and Japan, where we saw one having higher levels of hope, the other one having lower levels of hope, and also the impact of religious attendance as an important factor. In fact, we found religious attendance as the strongest predictor of hope. So that also has an implication. And of course, the idea of community and marriage, which also it's an important factor to consider when we are ultimately thinking of hope. Now, if this is your first time joining me or being on this platform or channel, I want to welcome you and make sure that you follow, subscribe to the platform. Make sure that you follow if you're watching or paying attention from LinkedIn or Facebook, or even from our Spotify channel. Now, I want to start by saying, if I ask you who has more hope for the future, whether it's a wealthy tech worker, for example, in Japan, in Tokyo, Japan, or maybe if it's a farmer somewhere in some rural village in Indonesia, who would you pick? Because I know that you will most likely think, well, someone that's doing well and someone in a tech firm, and Japan, it's a beautiful country, of course. I know that that would be the right, you would go for that person. But actually, most of us actually, I know, often will go for the money, will go for the safety of Japan, for example, or even the advanced healthcare system in that country. But I just share my work that just came out, and I think it's one of the biggest study on hope. It analyzed over 200,000 participants across 22 countries, and the results that we found were really very shocking. One, the fact that the wealthy nations, we noticed that they were struggling, whereas the developing countries were thriving with hope. Now, and today what I want to do is that I'm going to walk you through this new paper. It's called Where Hope Thrives, and I'll show you where hope actually lives, and why your environment ultimately might be killing your dream of a hopeful future. And if you're first here, if you're new here, again, my name is Dr. Victor Counter. I'm a researcher, a psychological scientist, and a professor of psychology. And recently, my colleagues and I, we published a paper titled Where Hope Thrives in the Journal of Happiness Studies. We used the data from the Global Flourishing Study. For those of you that don't know about the Global Flourishing Study, the Global Flourishing Study is the largest social science research project in modern history. And it's the largest of its kind. And so we kind of try to measure hope globally, along with all the constructs or variables that is related to human flourishing. And now we define hope in the study, in this particular paper, not just as hopeful thinking or some kind of cognitive motivational process, but ultimately as the ability to see a pathway to the future, and also having a sense of urgency to walk through it. Now, this is not separate in a way from Snyder's hope theory, it's kind of built from that. But ultimately, one of the arguments that we made in the paper was that this, the ability or capacity to see a pathway to the future that we desire and having the agency to walk through it or sustain it, it's contingent on stable relationships that we have with objects of hope. It could be objects of hope is also very much synonymous to objects of attachment. These are like things that we turn to, that we have a relationship with. It could be with place, it could be with the sacred, it could be with family, things that have that it's of significant relevance for us. And this is what we found in the data, which I think that there's a paradox there that it's very interesting as you start to think about this. And one of the things that we found was that the country with the highest hope score was Indonesia, followed by Mexico, Argentina, whereas on the other hand, the country with the lowest levels of hope was Japan, followed by Sweden, and the UK, and also some of the Western countries are following that. Now, you might ask the question, why is that? I think one could be the fact that Japan has a high GDP, as you know. On the other hand, Indonesia has community. Their economy is not as strong compared to that of Japan. But ultimately, I think our research ultimately points to a theory, and I call this spatial hope. And this simply means that hope is not just in one's head. It's in the place that you find yourself in the world. And in other words, what I mean by this is, for example, in individualistic cultures like in the West and to some degree also in Japan, we are told to find, people might be told to find hope alone as they are working, and their work and their success is tied to their capacity to become hopeful about a future. Whereas on the other hand, in collectivist countries or cultures like Indonesia or maybe to some degree Nigeria, hope is sort of a shared resource within a community. If one is doing okay, there's a sense of hope that kind of gravitates or kind of envelopes the community itself. In other words, you don't flourish alone, you ultimately flourish together. But also, I think there could also be the God factor, which I think is the strongest predictor of hope in our study. And I think it's important that we think about it because this was actually the most significant finding in the data, in the demographic data that we analyzed. We did a meta-analysis, ultimately looking at a lot of socio-demographic factors just to see how that maps on hope. And we looked at age, we looked at gender, we looked at education, we looked at financial stability, or you could say, one's financial status as their family in their family home. But ultimately, the strongest predictor of high hope across almost every country that we looked at was religious service attendance. People who attended things like a house of worship or churches or maybe mosque or the synagogue or some kind of temple more than once a week had significantly higher hope than those who did not. Now, you could ask, why is this the case? One, I think in the paper, we try to frame this using what I call, using a framework that I'm working on currently, a relational theory of hope. In other words, what that means is, one of the things that we were trying to say is that when you are connected to a sacred object, let's say to God or to a supportive community in the place of, let's say, your church or your mosque or your synagogue, you have a safety net ultimately because of the sense of belonging or connection that comes out of that. In other words, what that means is that you know that even when you fall, that community, that God will not ultimately fail you, that there will still, the community or the sacred will still carry you along. And I think that external anchor allows you as an individual to take risk and dream bigger, and in doing that, there's a hopeful future that comes because, again, there is a sense of, there's an object of hope that sustains a relationship with an object of hope that sustains that hopeful aspiration. We also found two other fascinating things in our study. For example, we found that self-employed people had higher levels of hope. Now, you could ask why. Well, that kind of makes logical sense because they have agency, right? They control their own time. They control what they, deal with or not want to deal with. Also, we found that older adults also often had a higher hope than the younger ones, especially the Gen Zs. The young people today, as you would imagine, are sort of facing a meaning crisis. Older generations, on the other hand, may have sort of settled into their identity, and that the crisis of meaning might not be something that they wrestle with per se. And so that kind of makes sense, in that way. But what is the takeaway from all this research, and how can we apply this? As I'm thinking about this, I always ask myself, what does this paper or research mean for me? As most of you know, my program of research is about looking at the psychological processes that shape human flourishing across cultures, and those processes involve considering the mechanisms of human flourishing, the disruptors of human flourishing, the adaptive responses that can lead to human flourishing, and then the outcomes of human flourishing. I'm not merely interested in the outcomes. I'm interested in the process that leads to those outcomes. And in terms of the mechanisms, I think I talk about psychospiritual mechanisms, and one of the psychospiritual mechanisms, and one of those is hope, which I define in some of my work as a psychospiritual process, which of course it's something, it's contingent on the place we live, but also is sustained by a relational bond ultimately with an object of hope. And so as I think about what this means, you just can't just move to Indonesia and just focus on the result. Well, Indonesia have high levels of hope, which is great. Another asks the question why, right? And I think you can replicate the environment of hope. Now, in fact, what this research shows is that hope thrives in interdependence, not independence. And in other words, if you're lonely, you are running low on hope, and if you're running low on hope, therefore perhaps you might need to find your village, you might need to find your tribe, you ultimately need to connect with a community that carries your burden, that can help activate your hopeful aspiration. You might also need to reconnect with the sacred, because our data actually shows that spiritual practice in terms of religious service attendance, it's a massive protective factor against despair. Especially despair is the absence of hope. The third part of that is that you've got to reclaim your urgent agency. Find one area of your life where you can take control. Enough, for those of you that might be thinking about what to do next, and how to get this paper or this study, I've kind of linked up the full paper in the description below if you want to kind of geek out on the statistics. And but I just want you to remember that hope is not, at least if you can take something out of this conversation today, remember that hope is not a feeling that you find inside. It's ultimately a resource that you find in relationships. Now, of course, we talk about threat hope and state hope. And particularly, I'm talking about state hope. It's not something you find on the inside. It's a resource that you find in stable, healthy relationship. If you want to understand more about how culture, how the place that you live can shape your mind, shape your hopeful aspiration, I want you to watch this video and many other videos on this platform, and learn how perhaps you can practice these or things that you could engage in that can help sustain your flourishing, But also, most importantly, I hope that you could watch this, the next couple of videos that I have. I'll be talking about the psychology for Ubuntu, for example, which is an African philosophy that ultimately explains some of the results that I've shared perfectly. I'm Dr. Victor Counted. I hope that you keep flourishing. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.